Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend." Jesus asked, "Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" And the lawyer said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." The word of God for the people of God. Please be seated. So interestingly enough, and right before this passage, Luke tells us about the time that Jesus was traveling to Jerusalem. And instead of going around Samaria, which is what Jewish people would typically do to get from Galilee to Jerusalem, because the Samaritans and the Jews hated one another, Jesus decided to go right straight down through Samaria. And he sends a couple of his disciples out ahead of him and says, go find his lodging in that village for the night. And the village found out that he was heading for Jerusalem, which is not where they believed worship should take place. And they said, "Sorry, you can't stay here." And when the emissaries came back and told Jesus what had happened, John and James, like, the sons of thunder, he's like, "God, Jesus, let us call down lightning and destroy them and wipe them off the face of the earth." And Jesus goes, "Get over it, boys. We'll just go on to the next city and find lodging there." Now, I think Luke intentionally put this ahead of the parable of the Good Samaritan because he's setting a context for what's about to happen. Lawyers in Jesus' time were also known as scribes. Their job was to read the Torah, to read the law, to interpret that law, and then tell the people how they were expected to live out that law. They were usually pretty well educated, and they were smart, and they were a little full of themselves. And so while Jesus is teaching, this particular scribe or lawyer decides he's going to test Jesus. In the ancient world, if you wanted to try and embarrass somebody in front of their peers, you would ask them difficult questions in front of them, hoping to trap them in the wrong answer. If you really wanted to know what they believed, you'd come to them in private. So in the middle of this crowd that Jesus has been teaching, this lawyer goes, "So Jesus, what is the greatest commandment?" He thought he had him, right? Jesus' twist on this is so interesting because he turns to the man and he says, "Well, what do you read? How do you interpret it?" He genuinely wanted to know how this person thought or believed about his understanding of the ancient scriptures that ruled and controlled life in ancient Judaism. Jesus was aware that there were different sects with different beliefs. There were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Sicarii, and many more that we don't ever hear about. Each rabbi had a school of thought that they adhered to, and not every rabbi believed the same as every other rabbi. There was plurality within Judaism, and Jesus is saying, that's okay. What is it you believe, and why? Jesus is open to other people's opinions and views. So the young man says, Well, it's to love God with all your heart, mind, soul, strength, and he actually adds one or two things there, and to love your neighbor at least as much as yourself. He thinks he's got Jesus, right? Because he gave him the right answer, and Jesus goes, "That's a good answer." He goes, "Now go live it out." Man, that had to cut, right? Go live. What are you talking? I'm a scribe. How can you dare treat me like that? And the man's ego was bruised now, so now he's got to dig at Jesus one more time. And he goes, "Okay, this will get him. Jesus, teacher, rabbi, who's my neighbor?" Because see, in ancient Judaism of Jesus' day, and in the Roman culture, and in most cultures, your neighbor were the people just like you. They dressed like you. They loved like you. They worshiped like you. They believed like you. They voted like you. And that was your neighbor. So Jesus launches into this parable and he says, there was this guy, and he doesn't identify him. He goes, he's on the road between Jericho and Jerusalem. And I've actually had the opportunity to walk part of that road on a trail up on these cliffs, and it's kind of like, woo, scary. And the guy's coming along the road, and he's traveling by himself, which first of all is really dangerous in the ancient world because bandits would hide in narrows and around corners, and if you were by yourself and they thought you had something they wanted, they'd jump out and attack you and rob you of everything you had, beat you if they had to, and then they'd lay in wait for the next person to come along, and having that person laying there hurting was bait for the next person they were going to beat up and rob and leave for dead. So Jesus says this happened to this man. He was pulled off his horse. He was beaten within an inch of his life. He was robbed. He was stripped of his clothing and left for dead. Now we have no way when these people go passing by to know what this person is. We have no way of knowing if they're naked, their ethnicity, no way of knowing their worship style, whether they're conservative or progressive or liberal. We don't know if they're Jews or if they're Gentiles. There's no way to know. And so then Jesus continues the parable and he says, pretty soon a priest came down the road, and when he saw this man lying on the side of the road, he moved to the other side and continued on his way. And pretty soon a Levite came by. They're the priestly class. And he sees the man in the ditch bleeding and dying and naked, and he moves to the other side and continues on. Now to Jesus' audience, this is embarrassing, right? The priests and the Levites, they're the ones that are supposed to care for people's pastoral needs, and they've walked right past this man in need. And their experience has been similar because during the Roman Empire, the high priesthood was managed by the Roman Empire, and it was as corrupt as could be. It was about making money off the people who came to worship any way they could and staying in power to keep Rome happy. And so the people who heard this parable understood this plight of these priests and Levites not taking care of this man because they weren't taking care of them. And Jesus says, finally, back up. So there's two reasons possibly that they skirted this. One is because if they were to get blood on their hands from another person, especially if they were a Gentile or a Samaritan or someone who wasn't their neighbor, they would be rendered ceremonially unclean, and they would have to give sacrifice and go through ritual cleansings. It could take up to a week, and if they were busy men, they had things to do. They had to get to the temple to do worship, right? Not to mention they were probably afraid that if they got off their horses or camels or whatever they were on, and to help that man, that those robbers would come out of the rocks and out of the woods and beat them up and rob them too. And they weren't going to risk life and limb. They had busy, important work to do. We can't stop and risk that. And then pretty soon a Samaritan comes along. Now, if you know anything about the ancient world of Jesus' time, the Samaritans hated the Jews, and the Jews hated the Samaritans. The Samaritans, because of what happened during the diaspora and the invasion, were believed to be half-bred Jews. They weren't full-blood Jews. They worshiped on a different mountain and thought that was where worship was to take place and not in the temple in Jerusalem. And they had different Pentateuchs, the first 5 books of the Bible. They despised one another. They were the other, the hated, the people we have things against, the ones we don't like. And this man gets off his horse. The hated, despised man gets off his horse or camel or donkey or whatever he was riding. And he sees the man in the ditch, and not knowing what his ethnicity was, what his religious tradition was, not knowing whether he was rich and poor, had pity on this man laying beside the road, bleeding to death. And if the Levites and the priests passed by this man, you can bet your bottom dollar that a whole bunch of other people did too. But this man had pity, and he stopped. He poured wine on his wounds to disinfect them. Then he poured oil on them and bandaged them to keep them from getting infected. And then he put him on his horse, donkey, camel, whatever, and had to walk. And he went to the nearest village and he found an inn, and he took care of this poor battered person for the rest of the day and through the night. And in the morning he comes to the innkeeper. It was probably the Holiday Inn or something, who knows. But he goes up to the desk and he goes, here's 2 denarii. Now, denarii was a lot of money for poor people in ancient Israel. It was an entire day's wage. And he gave the man 2 denarii on top of whatever fee he paid to stay in that inn that night, and said, look, take care of him for me. And if you spend more than this, when I come back this way, I will reimburse you. Isn't that an amazing story of mercy and pity and love and care and brotherly love? It's somebody that you don't even know stops and helps you on the side of the road just because they can, just because they're willing to. Now Jesus turns to this full of himself, egotistical scribe, and he says, so which man was your neighbor? And he's stuck, right? Jesus has got him cornered. The only answer he can give in front of this crowd is the man who showed mercy. And Jesus says, go and do likewise, and you will live. The neighbor in this story became the most unlikely person for a Jewish person in ancient Israel to call a neighbor. And the reason this passage is important for us today is because there is so much division and there is so much hate in our culture and society right now. We're divided by race, our faith tradition. We're divided by our view on sexuality and who we choose to love. We're divided by Democrat and Republican and independent. We're divided by income inequality, by perceived illnesses of other people who we think should just get over it and get better. We're divided by progressives and liberals and conservatives. And rather than figuring out how to talk about those things and to learn from those things and to continue to love one another regardless of our differences and do what God has called us to do, we'd rather categorize them as the other, someone we don't like, someone we don't get along with. They don't agree with us. They're those filthy Samaritans. Barbara Brown Taylor has been voted one of the 12 best preachers in the United States for several years. And she has a sermon on this particular passage that she preached at Riverside Church in New York. And she asked this question at the end. If you were lying in the ditch naked, bleeding, and half dead, who is the person you would least want to stop and rescue you? Think about that for a second. If you were laying in the ditch, bleeding, naked, and dying, who is the person or persons you would least want or least expect to stop and rescue you? The reason that question is important, because it answers this question. Who's your neighbor? Who's your neighbor? And see, this parable comes full circle from the questions, because remember what the question was? Rabbi, teacher, what is the greatest commandment? Well, what do you say? How do you read it? To love God with all your heart, soul, mind, spirit, and strength, and to love your neighbor as much as you love yourself. We live in a globalized world. Our neighbor is not just everybody we come in contact with, but is everybody we've never met all around the world. Jesus expanded the definition of neighbor dramatically in his time, and now we've expanded it dramatically in our time. We should care for each and every person regardless of our differences. And the hope is they will care and respect and love us regardless of our differences. I have a vision for this church. I want this church to be someplace where people who have been Christians for 50 years can come and still learn and still grow and can share what they've learned. And I want this to be a place where people who are seeking, trying to figure it out, who are asking questions, can come and ask questions and not be ridiculed for that. Where they can deal with their doubts and their concerns and everybody in between. I want us to be able to have difference of opinions and to be able to discuss it, to learn from each other, and in the end still love one another, still do ministry in this community. That's what we're called to do. But it's way too easy for us to vote with our attendance or to vote with our wallets or to just not hang out with the people we don't like. What an example we could set for the world if we could tolerate each other and our differences. Talk about them, learn about them, understand each other. What an example that would be to the culture around us. What do you want from this church? Who are you willing to see as neighbor instead of other? What are you willing to do? Who are you willing to love despite your differences? If you were dying, bleeding, naked, and laying in the ditch, who would be your neighbor?
My name's Anna Walker. I'm a board member, actually, less than a year in for the Good Samaritan Food Pantry. And Ginger had reached out to me since she was sharing about the food pantry with another congregation this morning. So we wanted to be able to share with you just a little bit about who we are and the way that we serve the community. I've always been that Jesus' teaching to feed the hungry and to care for those in need has always been dear to my heart. Since I was a little girl, I've worked at different food pantries where I was growing up in Georgia. So when I moved here in 2019, I guess that's right, I got connected with Ginger, and then most recently have been able to start serving on the board of directors. But the food pantry is actually 14 years old this year. It was started in a congregation. Ginger was one of those of the founding members. She and a group of others had decided that there was a need that wasn't being addressed, and that was to care for those in our community, especially in Jennings County, that didn't have enough to put food on their table for themselves and their children every night. And so they started the food pantry, and they're located now right next to the Cairo Train facility, just right down the road between the Goodwill and Cairo Train. So we're right there, and we're open on Tuesday through Friday, usually from about 10 to 2:30, and residents come in and out. All you have to do is show that you're a resident of Jennings County, and volunteers serve them boxes of food. Now, since last year, they had to sort of start with a drive-through system, but before that, the residents came into the pantry, the volunteers were interacting with them and getting to walk them through the different parts of the pantry that they could choose food from and pray with them. Especially, they have great need that they needed to want to be addressed spiritually as well, not just for their physical needs, but we know that God created us as whole beings, and so we wanted to be able to take care of all the needs that someone came in with. And so last year, I think we fed over 26,000 people. We know it was a great year of need, and have continued to serve faithfully. Ginger and her volunteers work there every day. They unpack the food trucks that come from Indianapolis, from the Gleaners Food Bank. They put it all together in the boxes, and then they serve it. So if it is something that you in particular might be feeling called or want to be a part of a ministry in this way, Ginger would love to have volunteers, whatever day of the week that you might be able to dedicate some time to, whether that's an hour, 2 hours, once a week, multiple times a week. She does run a very good ship there, as I'll call it, and they have a good system in place, and they want to make sure everyone is safe, and they want to make sure everyone gets fed who comes through those doors and treated with respect and dignity. And so if you are interested in any part of the food pantry's operations, I would encourage you to look them up. They're in probably the phone book, also on Facebook. I know often Facebook serves as a phone book these days for a lot of people. And I think their number is 352-0500, but don't quote me on that one. But if you just reach out during their hours of operation and ask for Ginger and say you're interested in volunteering, she'd be happy to share when a good time would be for you to do that, to come in, and whether that's pack up a food box or to receive someone and welcome them. There's all kinds of ways to serve. And she likes to say that you're never too young or too old. So she's had volunteers and their kids from the age of 3 years old that can carry one little can, and they would go and put it on the shelf. And then they would go get a loaf of bread and go put it on the shelf. And so you're never too young or too old to be part of God's kingdom here, and we especially want to be able to serve those in our county, in our community, and to bless them and to love them. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share about the pantry. If you do have questions, I do have to shoot out, but I don't usually know how this is, but I don't know if there's questions that you want me to.
If you want to take questions now, you can.
Okay. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. Yes?
Does all your food come through Gleaners?
It does not. So a lot of it does come from Gleaners, but we also use Midwest Food Bank, and then we do pickups from the local JC and Walmart when they have food that they have to donate. So we try and be local as well as through the main hubs of the food. Yeah, I think that's a great question.
We're Methodists. We're kind of quiet during the week.
It's all good. Well, thank you again for letting me share this morning.
Thank you for coming. I'm sorry if I got your last name wrong. I've talked to a bunch of people this week. And I'm
No
struggling
problem.
with names.
No problem.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
Make me